All right, well, without further ado, I'm gonna get it started. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and it's wonderful to have so many people in the audience from so many different parts of the world. I'm mostly gonna be talking about some examples from the US today, but I'll be curious from the questions how this compares to people's experiences elsewhere. So I will be talking within the overall theme of tree establishment about best practices for tree planting initiatives in urban areas. And this draws on a recently published article that I did with colleagues Theo Eisenman from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Johan Osberg from the Nature-Based Solutions Institute, and fellow Forest Service researchers Lindsay Campbell and Erica Svensson. So to start, I wanted to talk about what I mean by this term, tree planting initiatives, drawing on a different paper by Theo Eisenman. So tree planting initiatives, or TPIs, are a distinct form of urban greening, with that term urban greening encompassing other kinds of vegetation planting and stewardship, including green roofs and food gardens. TPIs are sometimes massive mayoral campaigns, with one of the most famous being Million Trees NYC, which started under Mayor Bloomberg in New York City and ended under the next mayor. Other Million Tree campaigns have actually ceased to exist or taken new forms when a new mayoral administration starts. And not all TPIs have such huge numbers. Some aim to plant 1,000 or 10,000 trees. Some are more narrowly focused on planting trees for canopy gains in specific neighborhoods. Others are responding to catastrophic losses of trees due to storms or pest outbreaks. And a definition of a tree planting initiative is a focused tree planting campaign that is distinct from a municipality's typical tree planting activity, such as operational or ceremonial planting. So what is it that makes TPIs different? They tend to have a separate name and website, and they tend to enhance and build upon the routine operational tree planting activities. TPIs also, more so than routine tree planting, tend to involve public-private partnerships and residents. TPIs also tend to have different funding sources. This pie chart shows that across the 41 TPIs surveyed in the US, about half had funding that comes from municipal budgets. The other half is a mix of corporate and private donations, state grants, and nonprofits. TPIs are usually limited to a single municipality 93% of the time. About 71% of TPIs receive funding that's outside of a routine municipal tree budget. About half of TPIs focus their work in specific neighborhoods, about half coordinated closely with nurseries, half had a species list tailored to their particular tree planting campaign, and about 40% of TPIs tracked survival of their trees, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that kind of theme later today with Daisy's talk as well. Lastly, about 1/3 of TPIs had a funding and administration plan or a planting plan. So where do TPIs fit into the larger management cycle? Within urban forestry broadly, the activity cycle from planning to engaging to selecting trees, planting trees, managing those trees, and finally removing those trees. When the cycle repeats with planting and decision-making about whether to replace and then what species to use as a replacement. So TPIs clearly fall into half of this cycle, the engagement, selection, and planting parts, and I'm going to come back to those a lot later in the presentation. But then actually plans should also touch on figuring out where to plant, what to plant, where to source the stock, and planning ahead for volunteer and paid labor. So really, TPIs are part of the planning process too. And there's certainly management and maintenance involved in the early tree care, so that just leaves removal as not being really all that related to a tree planting campaign, perhaps. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold here, so I'll be sipping on tea now and then too. So actually, when we talk about removal in arboriculture and urban forestry, we most often seem to talk about removal of mature trees and risk management. But the removal of dead baby trees is also really important. Quite a few trees do die in the early vulnerable establishment years, and even for the best run planting programs, some are inevitably going to die when they're very young. Such trees are not a physical risk to pedestrians or buildings or utility lines, but they are an eyesore and they can generate negative reactions from the public. So really the removal of standing baby dead trees is an important component of a tree planting initiative. So now let's step back for a minute. When it comes to the ultimate goals of TPIs, what are they? To plant trees, right? These photos here come from two of the amazing programs that I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with for research on tree survival and mortality. The Sacramento Shade Program of the Sacramento Tree Foundation in California, and the Greening the Gateway Cities program of the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. So, planting trees is the goal, right? Wrong. I hope I haven't just offended everyone in this webinar, so hear me out. Planting trees is a metric that gets at one part of the accomplishments, but it's not the primary goal. I argue that tree planting is not the goal in and of itself, but rather, tree planting is a means to achieving the broader goal of creating cities and towns that are more livable, sustainable, and equitable. The two programs I highlighted on the previous slide are actually a great example of clear goal articulation. Both programs are actually funded with a rationale for energy savings, albeit critical differences based on the local climate. The Sacramento Shade Program is focused on thermal comfort and building energy savings in the very hot summers of California's Central Valley, while the Greening the Gateway Cities program is focused on trees as windbreaks in the cold New England winters, and additionally focused on post-industrial mid-sized towns in Massachusetts and neighborhoods within those towns that meet environmental justice criteria. And it's important to emphasize that different TPIs can have different objectives, or sometimes objectives differ for particular planting sites and neighborhoods. One program might emphasize energy savings, while another might be narrowly focused on stormwater mitigation or equity, or nature play for children, or food produced through orchards. Maybe a program even targets more than one of these objectives. But here's a really critical thing to keep in mind. No single tree, planting site, or program can simultaneously maximize all of these objectives at once. Some goals have really obvious conflicts. If you're planting an orchard, you're not going to be maximizing shade. There are always going to be trade-offs. If you maximize one objective, then another objective gets downplayed. That's why it's really critical to develop a plan up front, and preferably with community and stakeholder input, what the main priority objectives are for a particular tree planting campaign, and then have those objectives guide species selection as well as decisions about what kind of land uses and neighborhoods to plant in. There's one more thing I want to go over before diving into the best practices, and that's a quick overview of typical urban tree lifespans. If some of you have heard that the average lifespan of a city tree is only 7 years, that's not true, that's a myth, and it's based on old estimates, not real field monitoring data. I could give an entire talk on just that topic, but for today, I'm going to do just 3 slides with some highlights. So this is called a survivorship curve, showing the proportion of trees surviving after planting. This comes from an ISA-sponsored literature review that I collaborated on, led by then grad student Deb Hilbert, who is now faculty at the State University of New York. Anyway, on the x-axis is years since planting. The y-axis is percent survivorship. The middle curve is based on the median or midpoint of annual mortality rates from a literature review. The upper curve is better than normal survivorship, based on the first quartile of annual mortality rates. The lower curve is based on the third quartile. That little bend at the 5-year point is based on how we sliced up the data from various studies, grouping together studies representing the first 5 years, what we call the establishment period, from studies representing times after that. And then we used a lighter gray color for these curves after 20 years because of the fact that there are extremely few studies reporting survival or mortality past 20 years, so we're extrapolating at that point. So that dashed line represents the population half-life when survivorship is 50%. In other words, when half of the planted trees have died and half survive. For the middle of the road typical situation, half of the planted trees are dead at 13 to 18 years. So if anybody asks you, how long do urban trees typically live? You can say about half will be dead by 13 to 18 years after planting, or just call it 15 years to keep things simple. For the better than normal situation, that number would be 33 to 38 years. For the worse than normal situation, it's 7 to 11 years. Notably, in this literature review, data from the US dominated, so it's possible that these numbers are different in other countries or other management contexts. So this slide is showing the same survivorship curve, but this time pointing out the proportion surviving to the 5-year mark. For better than normal scenario, about 80% of trees survive to 5 years. For middle of the road, it's about 70%. For worse than normal, it's about 60%. I think it's fair to ask ourselves, if trees really are green infrastructure, then let's think about other kinds of built infrastructure. Would we accept this rate of failure for bridges, street lighting, or sewer systems? Would it really be okay if the typical middle of the road performance was 30% of newly laid down sewer lines failing after 5 years, with only 70% still functioning? And one more thought to leave you with before I get onto the best practices. Although there are a great many factors related to tree mortality in urban settings, for establishment mortality, meaning the deaths in the first few years after planting, there's abundant evidence from my studies and many others that tree care is often the driving factor. Or to be clearer, when proper planting techniques and basic establishment maintenance are missing, young trees are much more likely to die. And now the best practices. I want to emphasize that everything I'm about to share is laid out in a new article that has been published at the Journal of the American Planning Association, and it's free to download through my agency, the U.S. Forest Service. The recommendations that my co-authors and I articulated are grounded in both scientific literature and from our own experiences studying and collaborating with tree planting programs. I like to think of these best practices as channeling the insights and wisdom that I've heard from arborists and community organizers over many years. These best practices are organized around 3 phases. Pre-planting, which includes setting goals, stakeholder and community engagement and planning. Installation, which includes buying and planting the trees and any other steps that need to happen to install the tree, such as cutting concrete and installing irrigation. And finally, the post-planting phase, when maintenance and monitoring are critical. So really, the timing of tree planting isn't limited to a single planting season or a planting day photo with the press. Instead, TPIs stretch several years before and several years after the planting itself. The photos shown here represent these phases in action. The pre-planting picture comes from a design charrette for tree planting by City Plants in Los Angeles. The installation picture comes from a volunteer tree planting event with the Tree Tenders program of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society in Philadelphia. And the post-planting picture shows university students monitoring trees planted through a state program in Holyoke, Massachusetts. The best practices are also organized around 5 themes, each of which cuts across all phases. The first theme we call Fund, ensure adequate funding across all phases. The second theme we call Place, adopt place-based landscape design. The third theme is People, conduct deep civic engagement and invest in communities. The fourth theme is Plant, and this theme is of course central to all the folks on this webinar. Follow established best practices from arboriculture for the development, installation, and care of trees. And last but not least, the fifth theme is Learn. Evaluate performance and outcomes and adapt accordingly from lessons learned. So this is a table depicting the 3 phases and 5 themes. I didn't put the text in each cell of the table because you wouldn't be able to read it, but we have a table like this in the published article. I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation going through detailed recommendations under each theme. And as I do that, think about the planting programs that you lead or support. In which themes and phases is your program strongest? Which need improvement? And how can you learn from how things are going to continuously improve for the next iteration? For the fund theme, I want to introduce you all to a term called green wasting, articulated by Johan Osberg and defined as an initiative presented to the public as environmentally meaningful, but which fails to achieve its goals. The photo here comes from England and a press article complaining of the wasted funds for a town's tree planting due to political pressure to rush to plant. According to this article, only 10% of the 6,500 trees that were planted survived. There's another example that I know of from Beijing in China, from trees planted prior to the 2008 Olympics, which basically violated all arboricultural norms in terms of lopping off roots and branches to pack trees into trucks and quickly plant them, as part of an effort to demonstrate a commitment to improving air quality. My grad school advisor, Joe McBride, studied those trees with another former student of his, Jun Yang. 25% of the trees were dead only 11 weeks after planting. I think we can all agree that we don't want these kinds of outcomes in press coverage. The last thing I want to see is for 1 year, the press to showcase a golden shovel planting event, and then a year or two later, news coverage about how that planting failed. Part of the problem, I think, is that budgets are sometimes organized to maximize the number of trees planted within the overall project budget. Based on the survey of 41 TPIs in the US that I mentioned earlier, the business as usual situation is that most money goes towards purchasing trees. And across those 41 TPIs in the US, only 12% of the budget typically goes towards establishment maintenance. So here's the somewhat radical suggestion. Consider roughly equal allocations of funding across the 3 phases, with 1/3 for each phase. Crucially, I want to emphasize that this is funding from all streams, which might include a mix of local government funding, philanthropic donations, and grants. However, since so many TPIs are dependent on short-term grants, city and town leaders are encouraged to consider ways to institutionalize funding streams, which can include ordinances or bylaws, stormwater and development permits, and bonds. Atlanta, Portland, and Washington, D.C. are among the cities in the US that have a special tree fund, which gets its money from ordinance violations and permit fees. So now let's consider the place theme. In deciding what to plant, where to plant, and how to go about the process of planting and tree care, it's important to take into consideration the environmental and social issues of a particular region, city, and neighborhood. One example of this is celebrating tree planting as a significant cultural event in a manner that honors the local community. This photo comes from a planting event in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles by City Plants. A mariachi band came to the celebration, which was a really special way to celebrate in a neighborhood that is predominantly Latino and rich with Chicano heritage, including a plaza known for its history of mariachi music. Another aspect of paying attention to place is to engage stakeholder networks, including various kinds of professionals. In addition to tree experts, and depending on the project, it might be a good idea to involve landscape architects, community organizing specialists, hydrologists, and civil engineers. These various professionals need to be part of the conversation, especially during the planning phase, which is what's shown in these photos from 2 different planting programs in Northwest Indiana. These professionals can then stay involved to ensure that installation goes well and afterwards to evaluate and provide feedback on performance. For neighborhoods and streets that have extensive concrete and pavement, landscape architects and city planners can help with making room for trees and coming up with creative design solutions to make space for pockets of trees and other vegetation. These kinds of steps are essential for tree planting and canopy growth in any neighborhood with high building density and limited areas of easily plantable sites. And over the past few months, I've heard from the city forester in Los Angeles really articulating this well, that landscape design to make room for trees is essential to increasing canopy cover, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. There's also been a big push recently to increase canopy cover in schools here in California, especially in children's play areas, so that kids have more shade and natural play spaces. However, since a lot of school grounds in California have extensive areas of pavement, there's literally not that much space for trees until that pavement and blacktop gets ripped out. So investing in landscape design and de-paving is a critical component of planting initiatives. These activities aren't separate from tree planting campaigns. They are a necessary step in the overall tree planting process. So next, on to the people theme. Engage residents and community leaders throughout all phases, from goal setting and project planning, and through planting day celebrations and maintenance of young trees. It's important to note that lack of community engagement can backfire. Some residents don't want trees, including situations where people have had experiences with tree-related problems, from fruit droppings that some might consider annoying to trees falling on people's homes and cars in a storm. While these tree-related problems can occur in cities and towns at all socioeconomic levels, the low-income communities can feel these problems particularly acutely because families don't have the funds to recover if a tree damages their car, pipes, or house. Sometimes residents might prefer small stature trees because they seem less likely to pose a financial risk in the future. In research I've done on barriers to participation in tree planting in Philadelphia with colleagues from Temple University, we found that stories circulate around neighborhoods about the dangers and problems from trees, and that residents had experienced decades of disinvestment from the municipal parks department. It wasn't that residents didn't like trees, it was that they didn't feel supported in having trees. And this is all related to inequitable patterns in some tree planting programs, with relatively wealthier neighborhoods tending to request trees more often. Something similar was found by another researcher studying in Detroit, Michigan. This was an opt-out street tree program in which residents were offered a free tree, but were given the right to refuse. 24% of residents refused this offer of trees, with their refusal related to their experiences around street tree care and the way that they weren't really involved in the planting process. It's important to listen to people's opinions and priorities and have that input shape where trees are planted and what species, and broadly recognizing that for some communities, there's a fundamental lack of trust in city government, and to try to rebuild that trust through community engagement and well-run planting programs. I also want to point out that the picture on the right of a dead baby tree comes from annual monitoring that I did in West Oakland in California during my dissertation work. There were major tree planting initiatives in that neighborhood at the time, but a lot of these new trees died, and I observed quite a few baby dead trees sitting there year after year, surrounded by weeds and trash. This kind of outcome isn't beautifying the street, and it's not providing environmental benefits. If anything, seeing this kind of outcome might just make residents even more skeptical of new planting programs. So at a bare minimum, trees that die while very young need to get removed. The people theme also encompasses sustained collaboration with local community leaders and residents, communication with the public, and workforce development. The two examples I put here are a social media campaign with clever hashtags from a yard tree giveaway program in Philadelphia. Those hashtags say, "We have great chemistry," and "I'll love you even when your branches are bare." And from the Tree Ambassadors program with City Plants in Los Angeles, a paid program for community representatives to be involved in the planting and care of trees in their neighborhoods. The conversation around tree equity and environmental justice has really taken off over the past several years, from local to state to national levels in the US and many other countries around urban forestry. However, that conversation is often narrowly focused on distributional justice, which includes the spatial distribution of existing canopy, as well as patterns of where trees get planted. However, environmental justice is a field that has existed over several decades, and it has 3 pillars. The distributional justice component is just one component. The other pillars are procedural justice, which is about how tree planting is planned and implemented, and recognitional justice, which is about how different cultures and worldviews are incorporated into tree planting. For TPIs to be truly equitable, it's important to offer meetings and communication materials in different languages for immigrant communities, and to offer meetings at times that working residents can attend, preferably with food and childcare. Doing deep and genuine community engagement is a core part of environmental justice. I want to borrow a line from the nonprofit American Forests here. Tree equity is not about trees, it's about people. For example, procedural and recognitional justice can be advanced through workforce development, offering paying jobs and career pathways for local residents, which can also help diversify the urban forestry workforce of tomorrow. Here are 2 additional pictures of workforce development, one program with the Tree San Diego nonprofit and another called the Roots Crew in Philadelphia. That latter program is one that I've been partnering to study, and it has paid local young people involved with recruiting neighbors to plant, doing the planting, and then post-planting maintenance. All of this being done in a working-class Black community of Southwest Philadelphia. The rationale for that program is that most residents there don't have the capacity to volunteer and are also skeptical of city programs due to a variety of past challenges. So having young people paid through a grant to a local horticultural center is a way of rebuilding trust, getting trees in the ground, and helping those trees survive. An important note here is that workforce development and green jobs programs are sometimes supported by philanthropies that aren't necessarily oriented around urban forestry, bringing in different sources of funding to planting campaigns. The next theme, plant, is the bread and butter of arborists' expertise. In the pre-planting phase, investing in this theme means investing in nursery relationships. For planting campaigns with huge purchasing power, there's even the potential for advanced procurement contracts to get the desired species mix. The past couple of decades have also seen in the US a resurgence of local nurseries run by nonprofits or municipalities, such as those shown in these photos, including San Jose, Los Angeles, and Philly. Another part of the plant theme in the pre-planting phase is matching species to intended tree benefits and goals. Native species are generally the best choice if the top objective is wildlife habitat, whereas large shade trees are appropriate if the objectives are shade and energy savings, and small stature species are right if the objectives are reducing tree risk related to built infrastructure, or certain small to medium species are best for their flowers and fruit, for cultural appreciation and food production. Also during the pre-planting phase and related to nurseries is the need to have a diverse palette of species, including species that can tolerate changing climate conditions. And all of that planning and prep work with nurseries can take substantial staff time and resources to accomplish. And of course, from sourcing nursery stock to planting techniques and establishment care, there are well-established best practices in arboriculture, some codified in standards and guides published on the ISA website. There's also simplified versions of these best practices for the general public that local urban forestry organizations produce, such as this example from Los Angeles. And although arborists rightfully debate certain finer points of planting techniques and maintenance strategies, from the research I've done, a lot of young tree losses come from extreme lack of any maintenance at all, such as trees that aren't getting watered, or were planted way too deep or too high, or for giveaway programs, trees that residents never even planted, or situations where the ties around the stakes never got adjusted and end up girdling the stem. From my dissertation research with the Sacramento Tree Foundation, when I gave my final presentation to the staff there about all the fancy statistics I'd run and conclusions about what factors related to young tree mortality, I was asked at the end, boil it down for me, what are the 3 biggest issues? And I replied, maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. Because that program is primarily for private residential yards, all maintenance is ultimately up to the residents or homeowners, and the staff adjusted their program to improve communication with residents following tree delivery to improve tree care. This brings me finally to the learn theme. Often when reporting on the performance of a TPI, 2 of the main metrics are the number of trees planted or given away and the number of volunteers. But personally, I don't actually think that's the best way to report on program performance or evaluate success. Instead, let's talk about the health, growth, and survival of trees through the establishment phase. And let's think about the main objectives for a particular initiative or planting site. For example, if the main objective was shade, then measure temperature as the trees grow. And on the side of people-centered outcomes and performances, keep track of resident perceptions, the ways in which volunteers get involved in other civic engagement, including tree advocacy, and evaluate the career paths for people in workforce development programs. The top picture on this slide is a report from my Forest Service colleagues in New York City who had an extensive partnership with municipal agencies, nonprofit organizations, and universities to evaluate that city's Million Trees campaign. The 2 images at the bottom are guides for urban tree monitoring that I co-led with Natalie Van Dorn, another Forest Service researcher. And I'll make sure to get these links to the webinar organizers later so you all can download them if you're curious. So these guides contain protocols for tracking trees for survival, growth, and health, as well as general tips and strategies for any organization that wants to monitor the trees that they plant and manage. And as a sidebar, we actually have training videos on the Forest Service YouTube page, and we have translated these guides into Spanish with help from the Forest Service International Programs Office and the International Institute of Tropical Forestry in Puerto Rico. And there's even a French translation in the works, thanks to the Canadian Forest Service. So this learn theme is not meant to be onerous. Rather, this theme is about setting aside time to reflect on success as well as failure. It doesn't have to be all intensive research led by university faculty. Evaluations can be more informal. Build in time for staff and stakeholder reflections. What worked? What didn't work? What are the lessons learned to improve practices and outcomes, whether for the next planting season or the next grant application? Over the next several slides, I'm going to talk about a study that I supported in Holyoke, Massachusetts, in partnership with the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Clark University. The trees in Holyoke were planted as part of a state-run planting program called Greening the Gateway Cities, with gateway cities being what Massachusetts calls its post-industrial, mid-sized towns with relatively lower income and higher portions of minority populations compared to statewide averages. Holyoke was one of the first cities in this program, and it's a town with a large Latino population. As the trees were being planted, the intention was for local property owners and a local Puerto Rican community organization would do all of the establishment care. But that plan quickly fell apart because of staffing issues at the local community group, plus honestly, that community group wasn't actually paid to do that kind of work. There were over 700 trees scattered across street trees, parks, parking lots, and institutional settings like schools and public housing. So what happened is that the state forestry staff realized that the community group didn't have the capacity to do tree care. These foresters and their seasonal crews ended up stepping in and did all of that establishment care, especially watering, for the trees in the public spaces, the street and park trees. A bad drought summer ended up happening right in the midst of the several-year planting campaign. Although Massachusetts is a climate that gets year-round precipitation, about 50 inches or 1,300 millimeters per year, the drought summer had only 60% of the normal rain. And so for Massachusetts, that was a really unusual summer. So we ended up having this kind of natural experiment with trees stewarded by two different groups, either the state foresters and their crews, or the program recipients, which were basically the property owners, with some trees experiencing this bad drought during their first two growing seasons, and others were planted just after the drought and didn't experience that stress. So this bar graph shows those different groupings along the bottom, and then the y-axis is the survival outcomes. So for instance, the trees that experienced the bad drought summer and were stewarded by the local property owners, these trees had by far the worst mortality. Only 47% survived, 53% died, and perhaps worst of all, most of those standing dead in the ground looking unsightly. For the statistical analysis, we compared the drought versus no drought difference across the two types of stewards. For the trees maintained by the state foresters and their crews, the drought had no statistical impact on survival. For the trees maintained by the property owners, there was indeed a big impact on survival. The trees stewarded by the foresters and their crews were 5 times more likely to survive. So I like to think of this study as boiling down to the conclusion that, no duh, if you water trees during a drought, they're more likely to live. So while that conclusion may seem obvious to all of you, the nuances came from the complex stewardship relationships among the many groups involved. And while my university colleagues and I were chugging the numbers and writing up this analysis, the state foresters had already made up their minds based on their anecdotal observations. For the rest of the towns in the Greening the Gateway Cities program, they planned ahead for tree care during the first couple summers to be done by the paid local crews. And sure enough, the monitoring that my university colleagues have done in the other towns showed that survival has improved. So this little story hits on all of the themes at once: fund, place, people, plant, and learn. And the next example I'm going to talk about also touches on multiple themes. So this comes from East Palo Alto, a town in the San Francisco Bay Area. About 600 trees were planted alongside the sound wall of a highway by a nonprofit called Canopy. The project was designed by a board-certified master arborist, Dave Muffley, and carried out with an enormous amount of labor from volunteers, including dedicated board members, as well as big volunteer work days from nearby corporations, and also tons of time from Canopy's Teen Urban Foresters program. These trees were closely supervised during contractor planting, and they received drip irrigation and extensive early care, including adjusting stakes, trimming back weeds from the highway sound wall, and pruning. The survivorship at 6 years after planting was 96.3%, which translates to only 0.6% annual mortality. This is actually the highest establishment survival in the published literature, and it's due to the combination of our arboricultural expertise, organizational capacity to train and manage volunteers, and a paid youth internship program. In conclusion, I want to remind everyone of a key point I made at the start of this presentation. The goal of tree planting initiatives is not to plant trees. Rather, tree planting is a means to a broader goal of creating livable, sustainable, and equitable towns and cities. Now, this doesn't mean that having a target to plant a large number of trees is inappropriate. Sometimes that numerical target is what's needed to secure grants and gain the support of local politicians. And having a golden shovel at a planting day is okay too. It can be fun for the funders and the mayor. It can get the media attention that's a nice feel-good story for the local press. But we do need to think so much bigger than golden shovel planting events for the politicians. For those who are really working in the trenches and making tree planting happen, I think it's critical to keep in the front of our minds what we're really planting all of these trees for, and have that guide how initiatives are structured, including the time and resources for the pre and post planting steps. So before I turn it over to Daisy and then we have questions, I want to express my deep appreciation for my co-authors on the article, which is the basis of this talk, as well as colleagues from the Forest Service and the Arbor Day Foundation who provided valuable feedback along the way. And last but not least, I want to offer my sincere appreciation to everyone who's ever let me study their trees or even just had a chat with me about how your program works, because those collaborations and conversations inspired everything that I said in this presentation. And in closing, here are some pictures from field work monitoring with a few different projects I've led here in the US. And we'll get to questions after Daisy. There's my email address if anybody wants to get in touch.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lara. That was absolutely great. That really interesting stuff. Some amazing figures and stuff in there as well. Lots of people in the chat. I think pleased to know that we all have exactly the same problems everywhere, because there's nobody in that chat is saying, well, we've got it cracked. We know exactly what we're doing. So fantastic. We will do questions at the end, as Lara said. So thank you for that. We'll now hand you straight over to our next presenter, Daisy Brasington. Daisy, it's all yours.
Good evening, John. Good evening, everyone, sorry, and thank you, John. I have and continue to be so inspired by these Wednesday webinars, so it's really an honour to be speaking to all of you this evening, and especially alongside such an esteemed researcher on the topic. Tonight, I'm going to be sharing results of research into the success of urban tree planting in England between 2012 and 2022. This is a research project which was initiated by the charity Fund for Trees. They promote sustainable urban treescapes through their work and research, as well as sharing some history on the topic and our key findings. I'm also going to share some of my own thoughts on how we might take action to positively affect tree planting outcomes local to us. If you want to dive into some of the detail about what I'm talking about and you have your phone out and you're watching on your desktop, you can scan that QR code now and you'll be taken to the report. Otherwise, John will probably put the link in the chat as well. Before I get going, a little introduction on how I've come to be working amongst so many wonderful tree-centric organisations. In 2019, I started volunteering with a tree planting organisation in West Yorkshire called Treesponsibility. That later led on to some work and voluntary work with an organisation called CIC called Forest Tree. And I subsequently moved back to Bristol, and I have carried on working both in a voluntary capacity and sometimes in a freelance capacity as a marketing consultant or photographer for other tree planting organisations. There's quite a few who aren't on this board tonight. Alongside starting volunteer tree planting around 2019, I was really lucky to land a maternity cover at an arboricultural consultancy practice called Crown Tree Consultancy. And through that, I've had some wonderful opportunities to attend Arboricultural Association events with Seeker, our tree decay detection dog. And it was actually on an Arboricultural Association webinar that I first picked up on the fact that the organisation Fund for Trees had a tender out to explore the efficacy of tree establishment in the urban environment. I hadn't long been sent an email by a colleague asking approximately how many trees don't make it in the average urban planting scheme. And I'd conducted a little 15-minute literature review, which had spiraled into the weekend because I came pretty transfixed with how little recent survey-based data I found on the topic of tree survival rates. When I heard about this tender, I was pretty excited about the fact that there was an organisation wanting to research this in detail. And 3 years later, entirely owing to Fund for Trees, really, that 15-minute literature review has spiralled into a 79-page report, and yet still more to say on the matter. So who are Fund for Trees? Fund for Trees are a registered charity promoting urban treescapes. They initiated this project as part of their research strategy, and they have 3 main objectives, but do a lot more. Their main objectives being to promote the conservation and improvement of the natural environment, educate the public, especially young people, about the protection and improvement of trees, particularly in and around urban areas. And together, we undertook a survey at the National Tree Officers Conference in 2022. And one of the things that we asked tree officers is how much they agreed with this statement. A lack of revenue funding to ensure post-planting maintenance is an issue impacting successful tree establishment. And unsurprisingly, there was quite a lot of, largely agreement with that state. And I think Lara already pointed to an article earlier, and I've also got the same article up there, the Telegraph article about this waste of taxpayers' money. So this is stuff that was really been on arboricultural professionals' minds for quite a while, and was on the minds of Fund for Trees when they were setting up this tender. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence in the public domain on social media. These are comments from various people's LinkedIn. And I know that you won't have time to read through all of these now and all of the text. This first bit of my presentation is quite text heavy, but you can come back and have a little look at some of this later. In 2017, when Michael Gove announced that 11 million new trees were going to be planted in the next Parliament, the Arboriculturals Association actually emphasised the need for tree management strategies that match these planting targets. And they cited high mortality rates as evidence that currently we were not providing adequate consideration to aftercare. And I saw quite a lot of that in the urban environment myself during the period which I was consulting with a lot of arboricultural professionals in order to approach this research from a sensible angle. Actually, as it goes, I spoke to contractors at both the times I spotted these things, and these are trees outside my local Lidl, and they are actually fine now. They rolled that truck back off, and I saw them moving that stuff off of it. Lara's already gone into some details tonight about why we plant trees, and I won't need to convince anyone here of their virtues. I want to point to a really great document developed, produced by Forestry Commission and Forest Research. Main author was Helen Davies, and this goes into the benefits of the ecosystem services which we derive from the urban forest, and I highly recommend reading it. The report splits these into cultural services, regulating services, and provisioning services. And I'm going to be giving you an example of the cultural services, like benefits to physical health, social development, cognitive capacity, economic benefits, and cultural connections. And in the regulating services, we have carbon sequestration, temperature regulation, stormwater regulation, air purification, noise mitigation. You know, I could go on and on again at that point about all the benefits of trees, but these verses published in the Isle of Man Times over 100 years ago seem more relevant to me than ever, as we all turn to nature-based solutions, including tree planting, for regulation services that mitigate against the effects of climate change. I'm particularly fond of the lines, what do we plant when we plant a tree? We plant a house when we plant the tree. What do we plant when we plant a tree? 1,000 things we daily see. And the author ends on, we plant the shade from the hot sun free. We plant all these when we plant a tree. But we don't plant shade if we don't actually end up with trees in the environment. And there has been quite a lot, well, actually there hasn't been quite a lot. There's been some investigation of this previously here in the UK. There was some investigation back in the 80s and 90s, and then there was a survey-based investigation where knowledgeable members like arboricultural professionals were asked for an estimated annual mortality rate in 2009 as part of the Trees in Towns 2 project that I'm sure Mark Johnston will talk about as well in his webinar in a few weeks. But yeah, not very many survey-based things. So we identified this need. We wanted to investigate with structured observations of tree characteristics, site characteristics, planting and post-planting maintenance, trees that were planted between 2012 and 2022. Before doing this research, we did quite a bit of background literature review. There is a lot more science in the actual review in the paper, but I just want to share that we really don't need any more compendiums on the correct way to plant a tree. I have found righteous opinions on the topic dating all the way back to 1825. You can see on the left there, and frequently discussed planting methods all the way through the 20th century newspaper articles. I can assure you that sufficiency of information isn't the problem. If you are looking for good advice, I really recommend on page 11 of my report, there's a well-curated list of organisations who've released volumes of freely available written guidance and videos on the topic. These are from people like Forest Research, the Tree Council, the Arb Association, Trees and Design Action Group, the Woodland Trust, Groundwork, Trees for Cities, the Conservation Volunteers, and there's many other professional organisations and national charities that actually have this. One of my favourite books, and don't worry, this is not my favourite book, I'm not doing a spoiler here, but is this Rutledge Urban Forestry Handbook. There's a particularly excellent chapter by Glyn Percival on abiotic stress. So I do recommend reading that if you're really geeking out on this topic. For a fee, the British Standards Institution, of course, offers guidance. And anybody who's from a local authority listening in tonight, please ensure that you're specifying planting, absolutely must ensure that you're specifying the BS 8545 compliant planting when you're requesting tree planting. I've actually found tenders using the wrong specification for tree planting contracts. So just a note to make sure you're using the right thing. And more recently, the British Standards have released BS 8640, which is a guide for tree pit designs and urban tree soils. So where this is relevant, it's also really important to now specify that one. Also found in newspaper clippings, I found a lot of observations by citizens about tree planting failure throughout history. There's one bottom left here, an article talking about 578 trees planted across 3 locations in Manchester between 1879 and 1890, which 203 had died at the time of writing. And commenting on this, a Mr. Charles Rowley said he believed that the trees had more sense than to live in such an appalling atmosphere as that of Manchester. They died, and it was a very proper thing for them to do. And I found a lot of articles talking about damage, so many I could not even begin to put them all together. And also quite a few that mention things like drought and soil conditions and often landscaping issues. But somebody who was not convinced on blaming vandalism alone was the researcher and founder of groundwork charity, Tony Bradshaw. And he's actually somebody who did investigate tree establishment survival in the 80s and early 90s. And he writes here, most of the trees that people see broken in the city centre have not in fact been attacked by vandals. It's simply because they've been neglected. And he says there's too little follow-up. And indeed, as Lara said, maintenance. We're just not seeing the level of care that we need in the urban environment. What else was found in the literature in terms of factors influencing establishment and survival? I split it in my report into 4 sections: pre-planting, planting, post-planting, and monitoring and evaluation. We've heard quite a lot about these kind of things tonight already from Lara, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm going to draw your attention to one thing that I just don't see enough of, and that is the removal of competing vegetation prior to planting. When I first planted trees with Tree Responsibility and with Forestry, I was not sent out with a shovel. I was sent out with a mattock to screef. So that is the term given to removing the competitive vegetation. So if I was to say something from a personal standpoint on this, things I've seen in tree planting, volunteer tree planting is, screefing will really give you a head start against that competing vegetation. So now on to the main research that we undertook. So that, again, this was initiated by Fund for Trees, and the project absolutely would have got nowhere though without the generous assistance of Kieran Doik and Carl Lothian, who provided me with assistance. Kieran helped me throughout the project, and Carl came down and did some survey training so that I was really familiar, not just with the protocol, but also we considered a few different things together while we were doing that. And we looked at 820 trees across 4 different cities, 48 different sites, and the trees were planted between 2012 and 2022. So all the trees that I surveyed had been in the ground for at least 2 growing seasons prior to the time of the survey. We looked at tree planting, which had been initiated through the creation of new developments, and also tree planting facilitated by a government grant. And the key research objectives really included looking at whether specific cohorts of trees from each of the 2 funding sources had been planted, if they had survived, and then describing the condition that they were in using structured observations. Another objective was to investigate the prevalence of specified variables that can influence successful tree establishment in the urban environment, looking to see if there was differences between funding source and whether any of these factors were significantly associated with different condition outcomes. So in terms of keeping things as similar as possible so that we could then compare things, we weren't looking at whip planting, so the really small type planting. In both instances, we were out there looking for standard trees, and we were looking within a 6-mile radius of each of the city centres. What I did find was that sometimes trees which had been specified at one size appeared to me to have potentially been planted at a smaller size. So yeah, there's a lot more detail about all of this in the main report, and you can get into that. The trees were surveyed using an adapted version of the Planted Tree Reinventory Protocol. This was developed by the Bloomington Urban Forest Research Group. This protocol is designed to provide standardized methods for tree planting organizations and citizen scientists to re-inventory planted trees. And it's informed by research on factors relating to urban tree growth and mortality. So again, in the report, there's a lot more detail provided than I have time to go into tonight on this. What I do want to do before I go into the results is just give you a picture in your head of typical trees in each of the Planted Tree Reinventory Protocol condition categories. Of particular note is the fair condition category. I think this may have been termed something different if the protocol was developed in the UK, as it indicated the tree was struggling in quite a variety of ways. You can read the full description of the condition variables via the link here to the urban forestry, to the Planted Tree Reinventory Protocol document. I'm actually going to just read out the description of the fair tree. So this is the description from the protocol. It says, thinning canopy, new growth in medium to low amounts, tree may be stunted, significant mechanical damage to trunk, new or old, insect disease affecting the tree, form not representative of species, premature full colouring on foliage, needs training, pruning. Meanwhile, in the poor description, it says tree is declining, visible dead branches over 5 centimetres, significant dieback, other branches in the inner and outer canopy, severe mechanical damage to trunk, stunted or minimum amount of new growth, needs priority pruning of dead wood. And on the right-hand side picture, it's possible that you can see it, possible not, but the leader of that tree has actually been completely snapped off. Okay, so of all of the trees that I surveyed, 31% of trees were in the absent category. That means that they weren't actually there on the day of my survey, and I'm going to just quite quickly move on to show you how that was split over the 2 funding sources that we investigated. You can see there that there was a large proportion of these trees were not there on the day of the survey. And with such a large proportion of the trees in the absent category, I felt it was necessary to conduct further investigation of each of the sites to discover how many of the trees were actually planted. I inquired with this matter with local people I encountered during the fieldwork, and later I thoroughly investigated it using Google Earth imagery and multiple angles and years of street view, any satellite imagery I could get my hands on, to be honest. And so here, for example, in this photograph, this is a resident showing me on their phone when they moved into their house. You can see that there was 3 trees planted outside. They looked to be little birch trees staked up, if I remember the conversation correctly. When I went to visit, that's the smaller photograph that's in set, there were no trees there. And, you know, it looks as if nothing was planted at all, but that's why it was quite important to do a bit of investigation on that. So of the 820 trees that I was looking for, 687 were actually planted and 133 I found were not planted. I didn't always have pre-planting plans for the grant funding led sites, so there's more detail on that in the report. What I'm going to do now is just, the table here is just sharing some information from the development led side. And unfortunately, 23% of the trees which should have been planted at development sites appeared not to be being planted at all. On one site I visited, 1 out of 20 trees that I was looking for was planted. Now that wasn't the norm. You can see, but you can see it there, you know, the range from 5 to 100% in terms of delivery. So yeah, that was pretty disappointing. Now, of the trees that were planted, figure 3 shows the percentage from each funding source in each of the consolidated condition categories. You can see that there was a very similar amount of trees that are sadly no longer with us in both funding categories. But what's important and significant, the significant difference here is the number of trees in the fair condition, in the poor condition category. Development-led sites were significantly more likely to be in poor condition than grant funding-led trees. I'm going to quickly go to what is actually later on in the report, in the official document, but it's the mortality rates. These are 2 different tables. The table on the left still includes a site which was considered an outlier. So I'm going to talk more about this table 10, where the outlier was removed. This was the outlier was a site with 100% mortality, but which only comprised of 4 trees, which were actually planted. And yeah, so you can see there in table 10 on the bottom, second to bottom row, in the blue section, this 4.5% for development-led trees. That mortality rate, if you imagine a scenario where 20 trees are planted, if you have a mortality rate of 4.5% annual mortality rate, then you only have 5 trees left after 30 years. So it's something to consider for those who are delivering BNG. In the UK, we have something called BNG, which is on development sites. It's a system of delivering ecological things that were lost. Not going to go into that now. Sorry, I don't want to segue and get off of the main topic. So, looking now again at these, what was going on, a little bit further about what was going on these sites. Found a lot of dieback on the development-led side, a significant amount more of really bad dieback. So dieback over 20% was found on the development-led side. So that probably doesn't surprise a lot of people, but yeah. I also found that 19% of the trees had no visible root flare on the day of the survey, and that the trees with no visible root flare were significantly more likely to be in fair or poor condition. And that's the graph that you can see here. So this is when looking at all of the trees together, we found that the impact of this, being planted too deep was, it did have an impact on where the likelihood of a tree being in a specific condition category. So it's something to really watch out for when you're on organising tree planting events, is that your trees are being planted at the right height. In terms of other indicators of stress, chlorosis and epicormic shoots were both found during the survey. There was more chlorosis found, a significant amount more chlorosis found at development sites than at grant funding sites, but exactly the same amount of epicormic shoots. And then this is probably one of the more shocking results from the survey. Lower trunk damage was really prevalent across both funding sources, and although it was more prevalent at development-led sites, it wasn't statistically significantly different. This actually it was something that was prevalent, you know, at both in both of them. And this has an impact on condition 2. Trees with lower trunk damage were significantly more likely to be in the fair condition category and less likely to be in the good condition category. I also found that trees with grass under the cover of the canopy type were significantly more likely to have lower trunk damage. And I also found that trees with weeds at the base, so that was in the 15 centimeters surrounding the tree, the bit very closest to the stem, when there was weeds in that bit, the trees were significantly less likely to have lower trunk damage. I ought to have put a picture in here of this, but some people may be able to visualize it. Often what I would see was that grass had been maintained right up into the tree. When that was the case and weeds were allowed to be left growing, the research showed that, you know, it was more likely that they were significantly less likely to have lower trunk damage. This is a graph I'm going to skip over quite quickly, but basically the takeaway is that looking at the five most predominant ground coverings encountered in the survey, trees with grass at the base were significantly more likely to be in poor condition. So high mortality rates really affect a tree program's ability to provide benefits. We know this, and these type of injuries will naturally have an impact on, you know, the longevity and the quality of the tree. So my question this evening is, in what way can we, you know, this is just to the audience to consider. I'd love to know your comments on how can planting organizations, development management companies and local authorities work together to solve this, because I think that they're sort of the people who are taking care of the urban realm. Another thing that the survey found was very high levels of other damage. Now, not all of this huge proportion of damaged present trees was bad damage, like you can see in the pictures on the right-hand side, something that the Bloomington protocol doesn't have on this section. It was bands like minor damage, moderate damage, severe damage, so it all just got clumped together. So yes, some of this damage was really bad and it did have an impact on the tree condition outcomes, but also I just wanted to say that some of it isn't. So if I'm moving on from this a bit quickly, it's not because I don't think it's significant. It certainly is. I have limited time, and yeah. So some of this damage might, for instance, have been being caused on the left there. You can see tree guards. Now, I have mainly found tree and stem guards only on the grant funding led sites. I really didn't find that many, but unfortunately where I found them, I often found them installed or maintained incorrectly. I've actually got one of these tree guards here tonight. It's a bit weird because I can't see myself on camera, so I don't know if I'm showing you this well, but this has been mangled by something mechanical at the top, and I found all this plastic as well. And I found loads of plastic stuff that we're leaving in the environment. I mean, it's quite striking. So I think we do need to think carefully as an industry about what we are putting out there, and that includes also in terms of staking. So these are the results for staking maintenance, and there was a very significant difference between the two funding sources. So development-led trees were much more likely to be found with incorrect staking. In fact, if you take out those 22% and the 41% and you just consider trees which were found staked, 79% of the development-led sites had trees which were, when trees were staked on development sites, they were found staked incorrectly 74% of the time. And on the grant funding led side, where trees were staked at grant funding led sites, they were done so incorrectly 36% of the time. So this really is something that we're seeing a lot more on the development site side. I'm going to come back to this in just one second because time might permit, but I'm just going to wrap up this little section talking about the research with the key findings and just go over that. So 23% of the development-led trees were not planted. Trees in poor condition with chlorosis and incorrectly staked trees were significantly more prevalent at development sites compared to the grant funding planted sites. I found widespread damage to the trees, and I consider much of it to have been avoidable. I found signs of insufficient care at planting and afterwards, and I found that current mortality rates could undermine long-term ecological and financial benefits. I'm just going to come back to this staking because on all of these topics, the report goes into quite a lot of detail. We're in really big trouble here because when trees, this is from an old article titled "Trouble at the Stake," written by Derek Patch, and he says, where trees have been supported for many years, removal of the support could allow the tree to lean, fall, or snap, or the stem to snap. It's necessary, therefore, to wean the tree from its support. And in a separate conversation in the discussion section of the article, somebody had asked the researchers Patch, Bradshaw, and Brown, does bark wounding result in the strengthening of the stem? And the researcher Brown replied, the idea has been tested by half-girdling trees which later snapped at the wound. Such an idea seems unreasonable. And I'm going to pull this second bit of his, different article, same paper. And again, the researcher Brown says, when stems are wounded, they may respond by producing callus and then one or more abnormally wide growth rings. In many species, this healed wound is intrinsically weaker than normal tissue. I think I've actually found this local to me. So this is a tree local to me that was locked up shortly after planting in 2022 as part of a new development scheme. I first photographed it in 2023 and it was pretty snug then, but the following year, owing to the fact that it was quite a vigorous tree and it was planted in the right location, it's as part of a SUD scheme and it was an alder, it looked in 2024, it looked as you see it in the middle photo there. Now, lucky for this tree, it was released by a local resident in the same month, but you can see there some striking damage. But this is the tree just earlier this month. And you can see that really, that is quite a dramatic transformation in just 2 growing seasons. So yeah, a little bit of careful consideration for what we as an industry now advocate for in terms of these. I think that in this instance, this site is close to me and I have, with residents and in conversation with local councillors and yeah, most importantly, the residents who actually just face right up to this, this planting scheme, we have removed a lot of these. Now, Lara was talking earlier about dead trees being left on sticks, and I went there this afternoon and there are dead trees left on sticks. You can see one of them in the front of that picture there. The contractors have never removed anything on this site, but the local residents have been involved in protecting some of the trees that actually are okay. Now, Lara's done a great job of already covering tonight what can be done about all of this. While we were writing up a paper for the Arb Association's magazine shortly after the research was published, myself, Kieran Doig and John Banks came up with these little 4 Ps. And I'm going to tonight add another one here of my own volition, which is polite intervention. I'm going to wrap up by sharing something a little bit left of field perhaps for an Arb thing, but this is something that was shared with me recently. And Oh yeah, sorry, I'm actually just going to go back here. Sorry. With regards to polite intervention, there's something else I want to share. And that's a quote from Gerard Winstanley of the Diggers Movement, 1649. It says, "Action is the life of all, and if thou dost not act, thou does nothing." And then I was shown this recently, which is an inspirational TED Talk by Krista Mayer. He suggests that things are easier to change, not through these actions listed on his conservative wisdom bingo card, but by creating the conditions for change itself. So in what ways can we as organizations actually create the conditions where people feel empowered to take action on this? While I was doing the research, people I encountered at their developments, they wanted to act, but they didn't really feel that they knew how, and they weren't sure if they could. So I think as an industry, we kind of have to work to address that and create opportunities for action exactly through the type of things that we've seen earlier in today's presentation. So paid work, and yeah, a lot of different things. I'm going to wrap up there. This just takes me to my final slide. An enormous thank you to Fund for Trees, all the trustees and their supporters. This would never have happened without you. And also my eternal gratitude to everybody whose own research and guidance have been invaluable to me through this project. I finally would like to thank the ARB Association for giving me time to share these findings today. And thank you finally to the audience who I know are out there listening, although I haven't been able to see you for a really long time or see anything in the chat because I've had an entire full screen of my presentation. So I'm going to end that now, and I think hopefully I'll be back in some sort of room with all of you guys. Oh, great, I'm here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daisy. That was great stuff. Okay, that was great, both of you. Thank you so much. We've got quite a few questions. So we've got lots of questions. I'm just going to pick some that I like. We've got about 15 minutes or so, something like that. Where was I going to start? Oh, I'll start with more of a sort of comment, perhaps. But if you have an idea about this, then you can go for it. Paula said, please can we have a tree planting register for tree planting initiatives like commemorative trees, like the ancient tree inventory, but for new trees? I thought that was quite a nice idea in some ways, because maybe that would put some sort of formal recognition in a collective way rather than everything being so, fragmented across the place. So that was more a thought.
Really easier if we had a kind of place, because when I went to look for these sites, especially on the grant funding side, there was no collection of stuff. So yeah, I fully support that kind of sentiment, that it would be lovely to have a really a uniform way of addressing that, something systematized.
I'll echo that while putting in a note of caution of it could lead to this just more counting of beans in the ground, which is not what any of us want. I mean, I'm seeing so many comments. I can't respond back because of whatever, I can't respond back, but it seems like the things that Daisy and I were talking about today resonate with a lot of you, a lot of similar complaints from things people have experienced in their towns, their work sites, whatnot. So yeah, something that is a way of registering trees that you're planting personally through a program, whatever, that fosters continued engagement, that fosters that education that's critical about how to take care of the trees and where to get new resources. But if it's just about counting beans, we don't need any more of that. So as with anything, it's like if it's done right, then that would be awesome. That would be fun.
Right. And thank you for mentioning that, Lara, as well, because for reasons I can't explain, the presenters are not allowed to engage with the audience through typing in the chat. I don't know why that is, but that's why. So if you've been desperate for attention from Daisy and Lara, they've not been ignoring you. It's because for some reason I haven't managed to find the button that makes that work yet. Okay, question. I just saw a comment appear from Chris saying he found a tree planted by Maggie Thatcher, and I could only see the first bit of the comment, and I don't know where that comment's going to go, but I'm not going to read it because I'm not going to read it out. Paul said, this is a good question. Paul's asked, and I think this is sort of for both of you, perhaps an opinion if nothing else, what's the best method of preventing vandalism of newly planted trees that you've encountered?
I've seen a few different things. I haven't seen enough quantified studies on this. This is going to be anecdotal knowledge, but still very worthwhile knowledge from different folks I've seen do this. Okay, one thing is in situations where it's not just vandalism as in like young people smacking a tree as they walk down the street, but like car door injuries and things like that, strategically placing the stakes, especially I'm thinking of street tree settings. So I've seen in San Francisco, there'll be sometimes 3 stakes with 2 of them closer to the curb where the cars would be. And sometimes even a little protective fence. It's not protecting against deer or herbivory, but it's just like a little thing that says, I'm taken care of by somebody. There's even a little sign. So both a physical barrier presented by the placement of those stakes and a little sign. I've seen sometimes when it's just 2 stakes, with the 2 stakes being put not at 180 degrees, but just off center a little bit, again, towards the street side. The other thing that I have been personally curious about for years and I've never seen investigated that I would love to see investigated, I'm going to call it the grandmother hypothesis. Sometimes when I've done field work, especially in lower income communities, grandmas come out and talk to me. And they tell me how they are taking care of the trees on their block and they're shooing away drug dealers and they're whatever the other amazing things are that they're doing. For context, my parents were social workers and my family is very colorful. So I think, wow, those are just like the grandmas that like my parents would have loved their clients to have like hooked up with in the neighborhood to protect them. So I think that there are sometimes grandmothers, sometimes corner store owners, sometimes like certain kind of neighborhood anchors who are taking care of a block, taking care of that particular little turf of land, not even a whole neighborhood, that could be leaned into to help protect trees. There was also a wonderful story that backs up this grandmother hypothesis from my grad school advisor, who said that when he, this was Joe McBride and his then student Dave Nowak, they were surveying some trees in Oakland. They noticed a few blocks whose trees were not vandalized. They asked some young people walking by what's going on. They say, well, that's Mrs. So-and-so's block. I'm not gonna mess with this block. So I feel like there's a real need to investigate the way in which certain kinds of community leaders that are not like labeled with a elected title, but that are nonetheless leaders in their tiny little micro neighborhood could be empowered to help protect against vandalism.
Yeah, I super support that. On page 52 of my report, I've got just one line that says, a resident with a view of a tree at a planting site nearby a busy children's play area where 53% of the planted trees had died, stated the reason the tree in front of their property remained was because they had been regularly intervening to stop children from damaging it. So although that was only one person's anecdote and it wasn't what I was researching, I did encounter that thing too. And I also support the 3 stakes. I've seen a lot of 3 stakes with a tree pan as well as being a really good way to prevent strimmer damage. And it just seems to provide that bit more physical barrier. My final point would be to water your trees adequately, because I can tell you nothing snaps so easy as a dry tree.
Very true, thank you. And a lot of research, I think, showing about the community engagement aspect when you're planting a tree as well, so that the community feels that, you know, it's something that they're contributing to rather than something that's being done to them, which can sometimes get people's backs up as well. So I'm not sure the research on it, but I've certainly read anecdotally that there's a lot of
There's enough like related evidence from urban forestry and other fields to show that like if something is not looking cared for, it's not like it's asking for it. I don't want to put it in that way, but like when something looks good, well cared for, there's a protective mechanism that discourages harm. And I think that's been well demonstrated in lots of other areas of social science and like urban landscapes.
Definitely, it's called the broken windows theory in some areas of social science.
Yeah, it also like leads to other kind of like risky things about police interventions, but yes, things related to like visual cues to care. There's rich bodies of literature on this in landscape design, landscape architecture. So I'm always in favor of more research, but we can also just lean on our own basic understandings of what's happening in terms of the social dynamics of these neighborhoods and encourage care and discourage vandalism through these different cues to care.
Brilliant. And that also, of course, ties in, Lara, to what you said. I was very pleased to hear you talking about the equity side of things and the fact that it goes beyond distributional equity as well, and it is about governance and all that sort of stuff. And they allowed me to do a little plug, which I'm going to do again right now, that in April next year, the Arbor Association is doing a 2-day symposium just about green equity, which is going to be a really great event. So thank you for prompting me to do that. Right, while we're talking about damage to trees, another one, the classic one, Christine has raised a point about Strimmers being such a significant factor in tree survival. Christine's asking, how can we reach out to landscape maintenance operatives? She said they're often low paid, sometimes unqualified. What we really need is trained horticultural professionals, which I'm sure we'd all agree with. But are there any ways either of you know of that we could try and engage more with the landscaping operatives?
So I would have one quick thing to say on this, then I'm going to let Lara speak. But one thing that I found really interesting recently is that there are actually mowing maps on quite a lot of council websites where the public are notified about which areas are maintained in what way. So if you're a tree planting organization, you could actually go and look for these mowing maps and then contact your local councillor to let them know what you're doing, and then, you know, kind of move past the Parks Department so that the Parks Department then get the notification, okay, stop mowing that area, or, you know, perhaps there's a conversation started that wasn't happening before. Yeah, that's one way.
I think that's a great suggestion, and it's going to lead me into my larger suggestion, which is the way the question was even posed got at the limitations in terms of the staff who are doing mowing or who are doing weed whacking, trimming, whatever the equipment and the technique is called. These folks are not trained or paid as arborists, so why are we expecting them to be arborists? And I'm going to lead into a study that we're starting on right now. We're kind of midway through here in California about trees in schools. And a lot of the schools, as with municipalities in general, a lot of these school districts are struggling financially. They have other competing interests on their resources in terms of like curriculum and aging built infrastructure. And so it's no wonder that they've had declining resources for outdoor landscape care. And so when I hear tree specialists complain that the guys on mowers are just not taking care, it's like, well, why would they? They've got 12 schools to mow. And, you know, they don't have time. And so having a certain respect for those laborers and asking or demanding that they get better pay and training. Not blame them. I'm not saying anyone even in this room is blaming them, but recognizing that it's a collaborative solution that needs all the different kinds of labor and stakeholders at the table to talk about how to come up with a solution. Because just saying, oh, well, now we just need some parents or some neighborhood volunteers to take care of it. Well, not everybody has that time. The particular landscape, if it's a school or otherwise, might not be accessible in off hours. And I think going back to kind of the central argument of the whole talk I was giving, planting day photo ops are sexy, but you know what else is sexy? Jobs, and well-paying jobs. And so maybe that's the way of making the argument to funders or politicians or whoever else that if we want to prevent this kind of damage at these sites, or we want other kinds of critical establishment maintenance to happen or poor care to not happen, then jobs are the things that can be hyped up, and well-paying jobs. I think that it's a much larger argument than just having one conversation with one person at one site. It's about like restructuring how we even think of the role of these different kinds of people and their jobs.
Yeah, I also
absolutely.
People who were on a really tight time frame. This was while I was doing the actual surveys, and I was surveying 9 trees which had been planted as part of the big tree plant, and I was actually in the presence of a parks maintenance person who was doing lawn mowing that day but had been involved in the planting that 9 years previously, and he stopped and chatted with me just for 1 minute because he really was so stretched, and just let me know, you know, like he had so many parks to mow, and I felt, you know, almost guilty about feeling, oh, I hope he's not damaging trees, you know. And I just think as well, the same thing happens with tree planters. I actually took a slide out of my presentation just to make it shorter, but it was to do with, it was an old press clipping of people being really disgruntled about the unemployed being used for tree planting back in the 1900s. Now, I actually found an article in 2023 advocating for something similar to happen again. And I just think, no, and no, it shouldn't really be children either. children plant trees in winter and then they go on summer holiday and they die, and then teachers replant them. And it is a sad fact that that is kind of a story that we're hearing. I'm not talking about a piece of research here, I'm just talking about anecdotes, but we've really got to address these problems, these structural problems where they are being caused, and not just gloss over them and think, oh, tree planting is such a lovely thing to do. It's just not, it shouldn't be like that. We wouldn't talk about healthcare delivery in this way, and we shouldn't be talking about trees in such a way either.
Yeah, it's a problem, isn't it? We want community engagement in tree planting, but it does often give the message that it's kind of an amateur activity that anyone can participate in, when actually it is quite sort of specialist stuff. A couple of points I just pick out from the chat. One is following on what you've said, really, Daisy. Chris has said you should get the mower gangs out for a day planting trees. Which kind of ties in a bit with, people who are involved in that may think a little bit more when they understand the damage that can be done. And I think Naomi's also made a great point, which is that we're seeing the time pressure issue affecting everything, well, everywhere, but in the landscape industry. And, we want people to be mowing grass quickly, and they're going to rush around doing stuff. And someone else also made the point, Rob, in fact, one of our trustees, hi Rob, made the point that if there's no weeds next to, or grass next to the stem, then you don't need to go and trim it, which is why we need to mulch and weed so much. So mulching is always a good thing to be doing.
And Screef, remove that grass before you plant the tree. Do not, and use mulch mats which actually block the light. I don't know how many times I've seen little bits of hessian lying on the ground, not blocking grass growth, not doing anything really. It's really a bugbear of mine, actually, to see that waste of resources.
Yeah, right. Okay, yes, and everybody's now giving their tips on mulching. Of course, it needs to be done properly. It needs to be topped up. It needs to not do stuff. What's happened?
I don't know.
What? The screen's just gone
I can still
big.
hear you, but the screen just disappeared.
Weird. I can hear me, but not see myself. Now I can just see me. I'm going to go on the chat and see, because if people can't see it properly, they'll all be shouting.
Well, we came back.
How? Now we're back. Wow, I told you it gets a bit existential doing these things.
All the excitement over debating mulch techniques in the chat just like blew up our videos.
It may well be that mulch has broken the internet.
Volcano mulch.
It was a volcano mulch, indeed. Okay, one more question I wanted to ask. This is specifically at Daisy, but Lara might have some thoughts as well. It's a question from Emma. Emma says, I understand that the government spent 48, this is in the UK government spent 48 million and 32 million pounds on the Urban Tree Challenge Fund and Local Authority Treescapes Fund, respectively. You obviously went to visit some of the grant-funded tree planting. Do you know if the government has released the official data on the success of those funding projects? And if they haven't released it, should they be releasing it? Should we be demanding they release it?
Do you mean have the Urban Tree Challenge Fund or the Trees for Climate, have they yet published any kind of report on the success of their entire project?
Yeah.
No, but the National Audit Office, I've mentioned in my research, did do, I think in 2022 they published something, and they actually, let me pull back, it's in my slides and I'll read it out to you. Just one second. So yeah, the Nature for Climate Fund tree planting program was launched. This is one of their evaluation points, the National Audit Office evaluation point on the Nature for Climate tree planting program was that it was unfortunately released without a robust monitoring framework, which could ultimately have increased the number of trees delivered and enabled more effective learning for future programs. So that was their evaluative point in 2022. And I'm not sure whether they actually have. I had a very crude go at calculating the loss based on my own figures, but I said in the report, it really is crude. I wasn't privy to the correct start point in terms of how much exactly had been invested into standard tree planting. So I was using an overall sum that I knew that what I've researched is only really representative of a portion of. So it was a crude calculation, but I did calculate that we've wasted some money there on what trees that are either no longer there or what don't seem to have been planted, or yeah, it's a shame. So I don't have any official figures in that department as yet.
I wanted to chime in. I don't know anything about that specific funding scheme, but it's par for the course typical. Like there's some massive planting happening and there's not a big investment in evaluation and monitoring, just like there's often not sufficient investment in the maintenance piece. But I don't want this webinar to leave people depressed, okay? I feel like there's a lot of like echoing back, yeah, I've seen that bad thing happen too in the chat, and you know, Daisy and I are speaking the same language of like, well, we've known how to do this for a while, so we need to do it better. Here's new ways of framing and thinking about how to do it better. But there are cases where it has been done right, okay? Find those cases, ask around about them, learn their details. I just popped over to John, and I hope he put it in the chat now. This publication I had from 2015 about 2 cases of very high survival, one of which I talked about today, the one from East Palo Alto. So that's right next to Palo Alto, which is very, very wealthy in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's like the headquarters of many of these big tech companies. East Palo Alto is not so wealthy. I mentioned that because like it's not the kind of place where the trees should have done well. But you know why they did well? Because there was private philanthropic funding for this Green Jobs program. And because there was a board certified master arborist, the highest level of ISA certification, who knew what he was doing and who was paid for his involvement and volunteered his time extra. And there were people on this board of this nice nonprofit doing all this work. And that's what led these trees to do so well, right? And we have in that paper a table of the labor hours of the volunteers and the paid staff and what it all took for both planting and maintenance. Then there was another project that I compared that to, which was in a neighborhood in Philadelphia, West Philly, that also had very high survival, not as ridiculously high as this case in East Palo Alto, but it was the same basic story was the amazing thing. The same basic story was little nonprofit working in a relatively small geographic area with a paid teen youth program. So take that paper, pull out the numbers from the table, use it to make arguments of I need funding for this, because I think if we let ourselves get depressed, we're just gonna not make any improvements. And that's a risk in all areas of society. But there are cases where it is done really, really well. They're not necessarily the most high profile, high number volume of trees cases, but it has been done well. So find those, celebrate them, and hopefully use that to make arguments to whoever it is that's providing the funding and the staff to get it done better the next time. And Daisy, I'm curious if you have any other reflections on that.
Yeah, I would give a shout out to the Birmingham tree people on that note. They've been doing some fantastic work. They've also been using the Bloomington tree reinventory protocol as part of some survey work, but they've been doing broader activities involving their community. Their tree warden type scheme is really well established, and they're working to integrate research more and more and more into what they're actually doing and delivering. I have encountered some really good schemes, don't get me wrong, throughout this. And individual sites were actually there were a couple of really well planted sites, and what went right on those sites, for instance, was that thing we talked about earlier, like the 3 stakes protecting the tree and certain stuff like that. So yeah, I think that there is now a sufficient amount of people working in a positive way on this that we could really learn from that. Something that I would really like to see is these tree planting organizations that don't really have enough money or resources in the initial instance anyway, to be given tools to monitor and evaluate their stuff that aren't onerous to them. So I actually, my research project wasn't a really high budget research project. I used a program called EpiCollect 5 to collect my data. And somebody from the Birmingham tree people is currently sort of reviewing and monitoring the planted tree reinventory protocol to really make it hyper relevant for the UK environment and to make it as easy as possible. Once that's done, if we can actually get that onto a platform that tree planting organizations can use for free and where they can monitor their own stuff, that would be such a positive step, because then we can start to share information. And I think a lot of people actually want to see this. Like a lot of planting organizations want to monitor their own stuff. They just don't necessarily feel that they have the time and resources. So breaking down any barriers to being able to get them that, whether it's through the software that they're using, like not putting these things behind very expensive software paywalls behind the county council line or whatever it is, making things accessible basically to the people who are really, really doing the work. Because it is long days. Planting trees is actually, when you're out there doing it, it's very long days, and then it's often long days behind a screen at home sending emails afterwards too. So anything we can do to help people to monitor these without actually creating another hurdle for organizations that are already up against it.
Well, that feels like a suitably positive note from both of you to end this on. That's what it's a shit sandwich, isn't it? That's what we've done there. We've just dropped in a bit of happiness at the end, and it could be okay. It will all be okay. Don't panic. One final question. Well, of course, there's loads of questions that come in. We haven't had time to go through all of them as ever, so we're going to send the questions and the chat to our presenters, and then they can see if anything particularly exciting catches their eye. So we'll be sending them all their way. But we do, of course, have time for my question, which is, what is your favourite tree-related book? I'm going to go for Lara first.
Tree-related. Oh.
So I have many favorites. Behind me are like many of my favorites. But I'm going to go with a book that I was introduced to recently by my kids. So it is a children's book suitable for like late elementary, middle school. It's called Wish Tree. So it is a fictional book about a tree in a neighborhood and the way in which the neighborhood loves it and has conflicts with it. And it's told from the point of view of the tree. And it's a red oak, and it's just a darling book. So I encourage that one if you need a little feel-good weekend, wrapped up with a cup of hot chocolate or tea or coffee, read Wish Tree.
Wish Tree, fantastic. Thank you very much. Daisy.
Well, I hadn't quite realised that it was necessarily going to be supposed to be a tree-related book, but
it doesn't have to be really. It's very broad. You've watched this before. It can be anything.
Yeah. Lucky for us, I've got quite a few books around me, so I'm going to pick one. This is something that it looks like a basic book, but I actually just find it absolutely lovely. The illustrations in it are really great, and for when you're going out and first doing a little bit of getting to know your local trees, this has actually never really left my car, because I find it really good to talk to the public with it and about trees and just go, it's not an ID book, but it kind of is. And then
so that's sorry, Daisy. That's Spot 50 Trees. Who's that by? Just so we will be honest.
So Spot 50 Trees is by. Hang on one second. It's Camilla della Bedoyere.
Okay, we'll Google it.
We'll Google that. Thanks.
There we go. We can see. We'll slow that down after the recording so we can put it in the comments. Sorry. Now your next one. You had two. I know you did.
So I've got three. My second one is Trees and Aftercare, published by the conservation volunteers and a woman called Barbara Kaiser. I think it was first published in 1996, I'm not sure, but just a lovely resource. I picked this up at one of the ARB conferences somewhere from the secondhand tree bookshop people. I've forgotten the names, I'm so sorry. And yeah, I just really love this book. It's old school, but it's got everything you need to know about looking after. And it says aftercare, you know, looking after your planted trees. But my real favorite book, and I go back to it all the time, is this. It's called There's No Planet B by Mike Lerner's-Lee. This is more, I work outside of tree stuff on, you know, wider sustainability issues. And this book is just super approachable on a number of topics. And it doesn't look down and tell you to not fly or be a vegetarian or do anything like that. It lets you just think about all of the issues with some really good hard facts. He's got another book called How Bad Are Bananas, and it looks into the carbon footprint of all sorts of things that you would never even have thought of. And yeah, his writing is really approachable, and he's an excellent guy. So I recommend reading something of his. He's also got a newer book out as well. Yeah, those are my books. I don't really read much.
Wonderful. Hey, you're too busy looking at dead trees. That's fine. You gotta have a hobby.
Reading research journals normally to read full books. It's true. It's
well, of course you are. I'm always reading research journals, so I don't possibly have time for fiction. Right. Brilliant choices. Two brilliant talks. Daisy, Lara, thank you so much. That really was wonderful. Everybody loved it. You'll be able to see the chat later. There's lots of love for you in there. So thank you both for your time and your wisdom. Thank you, everybody, for watching, of course. Next week, please do join us. Matt Disney, Phil Wilkes, and your host, Emma Gilmartin, the best Arboricultural Association webinar host out there, many people say. And trust me, they will say it. So hopefully you enjoy that next week. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care of yourselves. See you soon. Bye-bye.
To everyone.